Let me begin with a question to draw you in. What happens when the strategies of political theater collide with the hard, immovable realities of economics, governance, and power? The answer, as we are beginning to see, is that Donald Trump may very well have built a trap for others, but is now walking straight into his own disaster trap. Let us be clear. Trump's rise and persistence in American politics were never just about personality, though personality played a major role. His appeal was rooted in a simple narrative. He presented himself as the anti-establishment, the man who could break the gridlock of Washington, the businessman who would fix government with the same swagger he used in real estate and television. But here's the irony. The very tools he used to position himself as the savior of the system are now being turned against him. The bravado, the constant need to escalate, the refusal to compromise, the branding of politics as combat rather than compromise. Those strategies work for capturing headlines, but not for governing a deeply fractured nation. Donald Trump built his political identity on disruption, on breaking the mold of what a candidate and later a president was expected to be. That disruption carried him to power, it energized his supporters, and it defined his image as the outsider who would never play by the rules of the Washington establishment. But the very strategy that elevated him to national prominence has now begun to consume him, turning into the trap he cannot escape. Politics framed as a never-ending battle where escalation is the only response leaves no room for compromise, coalition building, or strategic retreat. And in the American system of checks and balances, where laws and institutions, however flawed, still exert some force, that strategy is now backfiring in ways Trump did not anticipate. Consider the cycle of escalation. Trump's signature move has always been to raise the stakes whenever challenged. A critic calls him out. He labels them with a derogatory nickname. A court pursues an investigation. He denounces it as a witch hunt. The media reports on his missteps. He brands them the enemy of the people. These tactics keep the spotlight on him, keep his base energized, and drown out opponents. But escalation, as a permanent mode of politics, is unsustainable. Each step up the ladder forces the next step to be even higher. Each outrage has to be outdone by the next, and eventually the cycle becomes a trap when escalation becomes expected. The moment he stops raising the stakes, he looks weak. And when he keeps raising them, he attracts more scrutiny, more backlash, and more legal exposure. It is a classic case of a strategy that worked brilliantly for capturing attention, but collapses under the weight of governing reality. What Trump underestimated is the difference between campaigning and governing. Campaigning thrives on spectacle. You can promise the world, throw red meat to your audience, and shift the narrative daily. Governing, however, demands structure, compromise, and above all, the building of sustainable solutions. By treating governing as just another campaign, Trump doubled down on rhetoric at the expense of results. The wall was never fully built. Manufacturing jobs did not return in meaningful numbers, and tax cuts disproportionately favored the wealthy. The mismatch between the promises and the outcomes widened over time, and the very style that had once seemed refreshing began to feel hollow to many. That is the danger of a politics built only on performance. It eventually reveals itself as empty theater. The trap becomes clearer when we examine the way Trump handled crisis. From the pandemic to racial justice protests, his instinct was always to escalate the rhetoric rather than address the underlying issues. He portrayed himself as the embattled leader fighting unseen forces, but in doing so, he alienated allies, hardened opposition, and deepened divisions. The refusal to compromise, once framed as strength, revealed itself as a liability in moments when leadership required flexibility. Even within his own party, the costs of constant escalation became apparent. Allies grew wary, cracks formed, and the burden of defending the indefensible began to erode his support among institutional Republicans. The irony is that Trump's strategy was designed to make him untouchable, yet it has made him more vulnerable than ever. By refusing compromise, he has fewer allies to shield him. By constantly escalating, he has invited legal and political challenges of unprecedented scope. By making politics synonymous with combat, he has left himself no way to step back, to recalibrate, or to rebuild trust. He is like a general who has convinced his army that retreat is cowardice, only to find himself encircled with no path to survival. The hooks that once pulled the crowds toward him are now pulling him deeper into the quicksand of his own creation. And so we see the trap in full view. Trump sought to dominate the narrative by never conceding ground, by always doubling down, by turning every setback into an opportunity for attack. But that strategy, left unchecked, is a self-devouring machine. It cannot sustain governance, it cannot withstand legal scrutiny, and it cannot rebuild credibility once the promises fail to materialize. He has walked straight into the disaster of his own making, and the very traits that once propelled him are now the forces dragging him down. When Donald Trump rose to political prominence, much of his appeal rested on the promise that he would finally deliver for the forgotten working class of America. He styled himself as the champion of the left behind, the man who understood the pain of hollowed-out manufacturing towns, shuttered factories, and communities devastated by decades of economic dislocation. His campaign rallies were filled with vows to bring back jobs, to renegotiate trade deals, to end the exploitation of American workers by foreign competitors, and to punish corporations that outsourced production abroad. Those promises struck a deep chord with millions of people, especially in regions where globalization had not brought prosperity, but unemployment, insecurity, and despair. It was a message wrapped in anger and grievance, but carried the hook of hope. That Trump, unlike the career politicians before him, would actually deliver. Yet, when we peel back the layers of rhetoric, the reality tells a very different story. Manufacturing jobs did not come flooding back. Global supply chains remained intact, and in some cases, outsourcing accelerated. Trade wars, especially with China, produced more uncertainty than relief, hitting farmers and small businesses with retaliatory tariffs while failing to generate the industrial revival Trump had promised. The rhetoric of protectionism was powerful, but the policies lacked coherence, and without a serious investment in infrastructure, education, or sustainable industries, the structural problems of the American economy remained untouched. What working Americans got instead were symbolic gestures, photo opportunities in factories, bold declarations about "Made in America," but not the substantive change they had been led to expect. The economic record becomes even more striking when we consider taxation. Trump's signature legislative achievement was the 2017 tax reform, a bill he hailed as a major win for ordinary families. But the details reveal that the lion's share of benefits went to corporations and the wealthy. Temporary cuts for the middle class were overshadowed by permanent cuts for big business. Far from draining the swamp, The administration entrenched it, filling it with lobbyists and insiders who ensured that the benefits flowed upward, not downward. For the working class Americans who had rallied to his message of economic justice, this was a profound betrayal. The trap was set a leader who promised relief from inequality ended up widening the very gap he had railed against. One cannot underestimate the symbolic power of Trump's economic messaging, but symbolism cannot substitute for lived experience. A worker in Ohio or Pennsylvania could cheer a fiery speech about punishing companies that outsource, but when their factory closed anyway, the disconnect grew obvious. A farmer in Iowa might initially applaud tough talk on China, but when exports plummeted under retaliatory tariffs, enthusiasm turned to frustration. This is the paradox Trump faced. His populist narrative depended on sustaining the illusion of economic revival, but reality kept undermining it. The longer the gap between rhetoric and results, the deeper the sense of disillusionment. Here lies the true disaster trap. Trump's populism created expectations he could never realistically fulfill, because his policies did not confront the systemic roots of inequality. Instead of reshaping the economy, he leaned on deregulation, tax cuts, and corporate favors, the very toolkit of the establishment he claimed to oppose. In effect, he weaponized resentment, but left the economic machinery untouched, guaranteeing that the frustrations he tapped into would only fester further. By failing to deliver, he not only risked alienating his base, but also deepened the cynicism that politics is nothing more than empty performance. Think of the hook in this contradiction. A man who promised to protect workers but signed bills that padded the profits of the corporations outsourcing their jobs. A president who vowed to punish Wall Street but stocked his administration with Wall Street veterans. A leader who claimed to fight for the little guy, but delivered policies that ensured the rich became richer at historic rates. These contradictions form the essence of the disaster trap, because they hollow out credibility over time. His supporters may forgive scandal after scandal, but they cannot ignore when their own lives remain precarious, while the promises dissolve into slogans. The enduring irony is that Trump understood the anger and despair of working people more clearly than many of his political rivals, yet he chose not to address its root causes. He could have pursued large-scale public investment, restructured trade with worker protections, or built a new safety net for communities in transition. Instead, he reverted to the conventional policies of tax cuts and deregulation, wrapped in fiery rhetoric. That decision sealed the trap. The populist brand remained, but the substance never materialized, and over time, that gap between words and reality grows into a chasm too wide to cross. The most striking element of Donald Trump's current predicament is the degree to which the legal and political reckoning surrounding him is of his own making. For years, he operated with the assumption that rules were malleable, that laws were negotiable, and that accountability was something for others, not for him. That attitude may have worked in the world of business, where lawsuits could be settled, debts renegotiated, and reputations managed with publicity stunts. But politics is not a private company. The state has its own momentum, its own institutions, and while imperfect, the machinery of law grinds slowly yet persistently. Trump's repeated defiance of norms, his relentless testing of boundaries, and his instinct to bulldoze rather than negotiate have accumulated into a tidal wave of legal and political consequences. That is the disaster trap unfolding before our eyes. from indictments on business fraud to investigations into election interference and mishandling of classified documents. The scope of Trump's legal exposure is unprecedented for a former U.S. president. Each case on its own might have been survivable. He has always been skilled at portraying himself as the target of unfair attacks. But the accumulation of cases erodes that defense. When investigations span from state courts to federal courts, from financial improprieties to national security violations, it becomes harder to sustain the narrative that this is all just a partisan witch hunt. The sheer breadth of legal jeopardy suggests not persecution, but a pattern, and that pattern is now visible to millions. The trap lies in the fact that his strategy of constant escalation, of dismissing every charge, attacking every prosecutor, and weaponizing every legal challenge as political theater, actually reinforces the image of a man at war with accountability itself. Here's the hook. Imagine a performer who thrives by daring the audience to believe he can pull off a dangerous stunt, but with each repetition, the risks increase. Eventually, the stunt goes wrong, not because of bad luck, but because the performer believed he was immune to failure. Trump's political life is built on stunts of that kind, testing limits, daring the system to react, assuming he can outmaneuver consequences. But now the system is reacting in full force. Prosecutors are moving forward. Judges are not swayed by spectacle, and juries will be drawn from ordinary citizens, not from his rallies. The very tactics that work to create political momentum, mockery, distraction, deflection, do not play the same way in a courtroom where evidence, testimony, and procedure hold sway. What compounds his troubles is the intertwining of legal and political consequences. Every indictment fuels a media frenzy that weakens his standing with moderate voters while simultaneously hardening the loyalty of his most fervent base. This dynamic is a double-edged sword. On one hand, he can raise money and mobilize supporters by painting himself as a victim of political persecution. On the other, he alienates independents and energizes opponents who see him as a threat to democratic norms. The trap emerges from this cycle. Leaning on the loyalty of his base helps him survive politically in the short term, but it deepens the alienation of the broader electorate and makes it harder to expand support beyond his core followers. It is the paradox of polarization. He thrives on it, yet it cages him at the same time. There is also the element of institutional fatigue. Political allies, especially within the Republican establishment, have endured years of defending Trump through scandal after scandal. But legal battles are different from political controversies. They drag on, they expose evidence, they force uncomfortable questions, and they demand loyalty long past the point where it is convenient. For Republicans eyeing their own futures, the cost of defending Trump against mounting legal troubles grows heavier with each passing month. The trap here is not only legal but relational. His circle of defenders shrinks as his need for them grows. The larger significance of this reckoning lies in the lesson it conveys about impunity. Trump believed that the sheer force of personality, the size of his following, and his ability to dominate media cycles could shield him from consequences. For a time, it seemed to work, but the law, even when delayed, has a way of catching up. The spectacle of a former president facing multiple criminal trials is not just about one individual. It is a message that the institutions he sought to defy are reasserting themselves. Whether or not they succeed fully is uncertain, But the very fact that he stands entangled in so many legal battles shows the limits of his strategy. And so Trump finds himself locked in a confrontation of his own making, unable to retreat, unwilling to compromise, and incapable of changing the playbook that brought him here. Every escalation may rally his supporters, but it also sharpens the knives of those determined to hold him accountable. He is caught in a trap where the louder he shouts, the deeper he sinks, and where the very persona that once made him untouchable is now ensuring that the reckoning cannot be avoided. Donald Trump's trajectory has always been about more than just one man's rise and fall. He is, in many ways, a mirror reflecting the fractures, failures, and contradictions of American politics and economics. The trap he now finds himself in, the convergence of legal, political, and personal consequences, is not simply a personal drama. It is a symptom of a larger sickness within the system itself. When a nation's politics becomes more performance than substance, more theater than governance, it eventually produces leaders who embody those very qualities. And when such leaders falter, their downfall becomes not only their own disaster, but also a cautionary tale for the society that allowed it to happen. Trump mastered the art of spectacle. He understood that in an age of 24/7 media, social platforms, and fragmented attention spans, outrage was currency. Every tweet, every rally, every insult was designed to provoke, to dominate the news cycle, to force everyone to talk about him on his terms. For a time, this strategy worked brilliantly. He kept himself in the spotlight and his opponents on the defensive, but spectacle by its nature has no depth. It is a firework display, loud, dazzling, and fleeting. The problem comes when a society mistakes spectacle for leadership. The hooks of Trump's performance, his defiance, his bravado, his unfiltered language, were powerful tools to capture attention, but they did not solve problems. They masked them. They distracted from them. And now, as the distractions wear thin, the underlying crisis of inequality, distrust, and polarization remain more entrenched than before. The larger warning here is that when politics is reduced to performance, accountability becomes almost impossible until disaster strikes. Trump was not the first to lean on spectacle, but he took it further than anyone before him, turning the presidency into a kind of reality show. The issue is not merely his failure to deliver on promises. It is the normalization of a style of politics that prioritizes entertainment over substance. Once politics is consumed this way, the public risks becoming desensitized to corruption, dismissive of truth, and willing to tolerate abuses of power as long as the performance continues. That is the systemic danger Trump represents. He is not the disease, he is the symptom that reveals how deep the disease runs. The irony is that Trump's eventual entrapment is baked into this very model. Spectacle creates momentum, but it cannot govern. Outrage can win elections, but it cannot build coalitions to pass meaningful legislation. Bravado can rally crowds, but it cannot negotiate with complex realities like global supply chains, climate change, or healthcare systems. Leaders who rely solely on spectacle eventually collapse under the weight of reality because problems require solutions, not slogans. Trump's unraveling shows this vividly. His constant need to escalate rhetoric without offering results has not only eroded his credibility, but also demonstrated to the world that American politics can elevate figures who are masters of performance, yet incapable of governance. Here's the hook. Imagine a stage actor who plays the role of a king so convincingly that the audience begins to believe he truly rules. until the curtain falls and the stagehands dismantle the set. Trump was that actor, and the American political stage enabled the illusion. But when the curtain comes down, when the legal system asserts itself, when the realities of policy and governance crash against the performance, the illusion shatters. And in that shattering lies the warning, not just that Trump was undone, but that a system which rewards spectacle will likely produce more like him unless something changes. Trump's trap, therefore, becomes a societal mirror. It shows how vulnerable democracy becomes when citizens are driven by anger rather than vision, when media amplifies conflict rather than context, and when leaders are chosen for their ability to provoke rather than their capacity to govern. He has walked into disaster, yes, but the path was paved by decades of disillusionment, economic abandonment, and political failure. The trap was waiting for him, but it was also waiting for us. Unless the underlying culture of spectacle is confronted, the stage will be set again, and another performer will take the role, promising salvation while leading us deeper into dysfunction. So let me close with this. If you believe politics should be about building real alternatives, about addressing inequality, about empowering workers, about making democracy more than a stage performance, then take note of what's happening now. The fall of Trump into his own trap is not the end of the story. It is the warning flare. Unless we create a system that responds to people's needs instead of manipulating their fears, the traps will keep being set and others will walk into them. The choice, as always, is ours to make. Thank you.